Firstly, a shout out to Happy Ronk 1963 for suggesting this interesting case, and a thank you to all of you for your support. Now on with the video. Graham Young was a British serial killer who ended the lives of at least 4 people in the 1960s and 1970s, with him beginning his crimes when he was only 13 years old. Young is unusual because his weapon of choice was poison, with him having an encyclopaedic knowledge of substances which would incapacitate and kill others, with him eventually being dubbed the Teacup Poisoner. Despite clearly being a dangerous individual, it appears the authorities showed a complete lack of insight into the predator in their midst, and a number of almost inexplicable decisions meant that Young was placed in positions where he could poison and kill multiple people. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young in Neasden, Middlesex in the UK. He also had an older sister, Winifred. Young's mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 14 weeks old. Fred, overcome with grief, felt he could no longer look after the children, so Young was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, whilst his sister was sent to live with their grandparents. Young spent 2 years living with his aunt and uncle and became close to them. Eventually, his father recovered, remarried a woman called Molly, and the family reunited, moving to St Albans in the county of Hertfordshire, north of London. However, Young appeared to take separation from his aunt and uncle badly, and, from this point on, seemed to withdraw into himself and was described as, quote, a peculiar child who made no effort to socialise with other children. Young was a voracious reader, and, from the time he could read, was never far from a book. He became fascinated with 3 particular topics: poisoners, Nazi Germany, and the occult. With regards to the first of these topics, Young became particularly fascinated with the crimes of Hawley, Harvey, Crippen, who murdered his wife Cora with poison in 1910, before fleeing to America, before he was captured, returned to England, and executed that same year. Young also cited Victorian poisoner William Palmer as being a particular hero of his. Palmer was an English doctor, dubbed the, quote, Prince of Poisoners, who was executed by hanging in 1856 for the murder of a friend to inherit his estate. However, he's suspected of killing around 15 people by poisoning, including his wife, 4 of his infant children, his brother, and his mother-in-law. Young's research led him, at a very young age, to have developed an almost encyclopaedic knowledge of poisons. Young was also obsessed with Nazi Germany and would tell anyone who would listen how Hitler was, quote, misunderstood. He even took to making himself swastikas, including a brass medallion displaying this symbol, which he would proudly wear. With regards to the occult, Young appeared to fixate on this and developed a belief that he could receive power through sacrifice, and even allegedly tried to get local children involved in sacrificing cats for this purpose. Cats did disappear at an alarming frequency in the neighbourhood around Young's childhood home, and, whilst it was never determined to be him, I think this is likely. So you have a child with an in-depth knowledge of poisons, who was obsessed with Hitler, the architect of a regime that exterminated millions of people through use of poison gas, as well as having a fixation on death and an obsession with famous poisoners. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, it turned out a lot, and this was enabled by a bizarre quirk of society at this time. Specifically, between at least the 1800s and it would appear until the 1970s, people could freely purchase lethal doses of poison without any real oversight or questions being asked. Poisons such as arsenic were freely available in different forms, including rat poison and flypaper, and others you could buy just in their natural state. All one needed to obtain this was to walk into a chemist, buy the items, and then sign what is known as the, quote, poison register. This still exists to this day, but, in fact, this case led to a tightening in the sale of poisons. However, back in the day, people would, it appears from looking at other cases, just sign the register, often giving false details without anyone batting an eyelid. This was apparently the case in the 1960s, where at the age of 13 years old, Graham Young walked into several chemists and, due to his extensive knowledge of poisons, was able to convince him that he was 17 years old. This enabled Young to purchase lethal quantities of various poisons, including his two favourites, Thallium and Antimony, with him signing the poison register as M.E. Evans. I'm not a chemist, but I've looked into both of these substances that Young purchased, and they are vicious, with them causing, amongst other things, extreme abdominal and muscular pain, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, as well as causing serious damage to the internal organs and nervous system. Death can be quick or slow, depending on whether single large doses are administered or smaller doses are given over a longer period of time. But as the organs and bodily functions are disrupted, individuals can die in excruciating agony. Thallium is particularly lethal, and even touching it can be deadly. How much poison Young was able to purchase at the age of 13 is not explicitly stated, but it's estimated that he was able to purchase enough to kill 100 to 300 people. Young took these poisons and began experimenting with them, using a chemistry set that his father had bought him. It's believed that Graham Young began poisoning others at around the age of 13, with him administering doses of poison to a child of a similar age called Christopher Williams. Christopher, I've read, was Young's only friend, and it was used as a type of guinea pig, with Young administering a cocktail of poisons over a protracted period of time, which meant he experienced vomiting, cramps and headache. How he did this is unclear, but it appears that Young and Christopher would often exchange their sandwiches at lunchtime at school, so it's likely that Young laced these with poison. Christopher was lucky to survive, but it appears that Young was unsatisfied with this experience, as the poisoning meant that Christopher was off school, and so he could not observe his experiment up close. Young needed subjects he could poison and then watch deteriorate, so he turned to his own family. In February 1961, still aged only 13, Graham Young began poisoning members of his own family. He first began by poisoning his stepmother, Molly Young, administering antimony to her drinks and food. This led to her suffering vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach pains. In the next month, Fred Young, patriarch of the family, also suffered from similar stomach cramps, which would leave him bedbound for days at a time. In November 1961, Young's sister Winifred was given a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found it tasted so sour she took one mouthful and then threw it away. An hour later she was on a train to work, where she began to hallucinate. Members of the public had to help her when she collapsed at the train station, and an ambulance was called. Tests in hospital revealed she'd been poisoned. Fred suspected his son of having been responsible and searched his room where his chemistry set was located. However, Fred took no further action, aside from telling Young to be careful in the future when, quote, messing about with those bloody chemicals. It appears that over 1961, Young was administering small doses of poison, specifically antimony, to his sister, father and stepmother, but in 1962, the main focus of his experiment was his stepmother Molly. On the evening of the 21st of April 1962, Molly was found writhing in agony in the garden, with Young stood watching her, fascinated by her death throes. It transpired that Young had either got bored of the protracted nature of his current experiment or decided to escalate his behaviour, and had poisoned Molly with a lethal dose of thallium the day before. Molly was taken to hospital, where she died in agony a few hours later. Her death was assigned to complications related to a car accident which she'd recently had, which I find inexplicable. Young suggested that Molly should be cremated, which occurred, so no further examination of her corpse could take place. Graham Young appeared to be fixated on harming as many people as possible, and at Molly's wake, he laced a mustard jar with poison, leading to at least one man becoming seriously ill. With Molly out of the way, Young continued poisoning his father and sister, and this only stopped when Fred was hospitalised in May 1962 after his attacks of vomiting and cramping became increasingly severe. Tests were run, and Fred was found to have been poisoned over months with antimony, and he was believed to be one dose away from death. However, Fred still appeared unable or unwilling to believe his son was to blame. It was his school that finally raised the alarm, after a teacher found vials of poison in his desk. The school had Young interviewed by a psychiatrist, posing as a careers advisor, and it became clear that Young was obsessed with poisons and had clearly used these substances to harm others. The school called the police, and on the 23rd of May 1962, Graham Young was arrested when he returned home from school. When Graham Young was arrested in May 1962, he was found in possession of vials of poison in his school blazer, and he freely admitted, apparently with great pride, to having poisoned his father, sister, a school friend, and his stepmother Molly, and that he deliberately administered a lethal dose to the latter, resulting in her death. Due to the cremation of Molly's body, there was no way to verify his claims that he had murdered her, and therefore he couldn't be charged with this. Instead, he was charged with 3 counts of, quote, malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict grievous bodily harm. In July 1962, Graham Young appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the charges and was assessed by psychiatrists. One, Dr. Christopher Fish, testified in court that Young was a psychopath who had failed to, quote, develop a normal moral sense, and he felt that Young was extremely likely to reoffend. He also recounted a conversation with Young where he was unconcerned about the damage he had caused, but instead was upset about being unable to get his hands on his vials of poison, with him saying, quote, I'm missing my antimony, I miss the power it gives me. The recommendation was that Graham Young should be sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital and remain there for a term of at least 15 years, with his release back into the community only being directed if he was no longer deemed a danger to society. So, at the age of just 14 years old, Graham Young became one of the youngest patients to ever enter Broadmoor. Interesting fact, the youngest patient ever to enter Broadmoor was a person called William Giles, who was sent there at the age of 10 in 1885 after committing arson. He spent the rest of his life, 77 years in Broadmoor, dying there in 1962 aged 87. Graham Young is one of those rare people who is so dangerous there's literally no environment which can contain them and protect those around them. As an example, soon after coming to Broadmoor, a patient called John Berridge died an agonising death from cyanide poisoning. This was a man that Young had written about in his letters to his family, stating that John was annoying him with his snoring. So, Young decided to eliminate the issue. He took laurel bush leaves, of which there were large amounts in the locality, and which naturally contained cyanide, extracted this, and then used it to poison John. Young freely confessed that he'd killed John to staff at Broadmoor, but for some inexplicable reason, they marked his death as a suicide. I imagine this was just to avoid the hassle of an inquiry. However, this was not an isolated incident. On one occasion, bleach was found in staff's coffee, and in 1968, so 6 years into Graham Young's stay, industrial cleaner was found to have gone missing, and this was found in the communal tea urn used by approximately 100 people, but luckily before anyone had drunk from it. It appears that both staff and patients knew full well what Young was doing, and it stated that staff would jokingly tell patients, quote, unless you behave, I'll let Graham make your coffee. Young was also still fascinated with Nazism and would walk around Broadmoor adorned with swastikas he'd made, including pendants and medallions. He would also continue to espouse the virtues of Hitler. Despite his behaviour in Broadmoor, including him confessing that he killed a fellow patient, his original suggested tariff of 15 years, and the fact that he clearly tried to poison others over the years, in 1970, Broadmoor psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin wrote to the Home Secretary and recommended that Graham Young should be released, as he was no longer a danger to society and, quote, no longer obsessed with poisons, violence and mischief. Cynically, I think this bizarre decision was potentially due to the fact that Young was causing so many issues in Broadmoor and they just wanted to get rid of him, or perhaps Dr. Udwin was really crap at his job. Either way, in early 1971, after 8 years in Broadmoor and aged just 23, this dangerous psychopath was released from Broadmoor. Just prior to his release, he told a nurse, quote, when I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place. This comment was considered a serious threat, noted down and put in Young's file, but was never acted upon. If you think that this is a calamity of failures, what happened next is even more staggering. As soon as Graham Young was released in early 1971, he appeared to go on a journey down memory lane, going to chemists that he bought poison from and proudly stating his name, and appearing to be disappointed when they did not receive him as some sort of celebrity. Similarly, Young approached his old school teachers and spoke to them about his time away, focusing more on telling them about his crimes as opposed to his rehabilitation. Again, Young appeared unhappy that he was not more infamous, and that the world had apparently continued turning despite his absence. Within weeks of his release, Young had purchased his favourite poisons, Thallium and Antimony, from a chemist and began to poison people. He began with 34-year-old Trevor Speakes, who was a housemate at a hostel he was staying at in Slough, Berkshire. Soon after Young moved in, Trevor began to experience abdominal pains and sickness whenever he drank anything. Young said a glass of wine would help his symptoms, but this only made the sickness worse. Trevor survived, but had severe abdominal pains for years. Around this same time, another man, whose name I cannot find, apparently had a drink with a man who looked exactly like Graham Young and who was obsessed with poisons. This man apparently became severely ill but survived, but eventually, years later, committed suicide because of the ongoing severe pain that he experienced from being poisoned. In May 1971, Graham Young moved to Hertfordshire and applied for a job at a small firm called John Hadland Limited in the village of Bovington, which made photographic lenses. The company contacted Broadmoor for references and were apparently informed that Young was rehabilitated. However, Broadmoor did not tell the company that Young was a convicted poisoner, had admitted killing a fellow patient, and had made threats to kill people when he got out, so he was hired. Young's job included making and distributing hot drinks, and each employee had their own mug, so it was easier for him to target specific individuals. Young was described as a morose, unsociable man who would only become involved in conversations if they were on topics he was interested in, specifically war, Nazis, poison, and famous murderers. Aside from these interactions, he would keep himself to himself and barely speak to anyone unless he absolutely had to. Immediately, Young began poisoning his co-workers. Young began to poison 59-year-old Bob Egle, his immediate superior. Bob was a World War II veteran and, within days of first meeting Young, had to take time off work with diarrhoea, vomiting and severe stomach pains. Bob's health improved when he left to go on holiday, but when he returned, as with his stepmother Molly all those years ago, Graham Young laced Bob's tea with a fatal dose of thallium. Bob's condition deteriorated quickly, resulting in him having profuse vomiting and diarrhoea, as well as extreme pain in his abdomen and back. Bob was admitted to hospital and transferred to the intensive care unit. However, his organs shut down, and Bob died an agonising death on the 7th of July 1971. His death was not considered suspicious. The callousness of Graham Young is demonstrated by his feigned concern for Bob, with him regularly calling the hospital to get updates on his condition. I have no doubt that this was his way of getting a sick thrill by getting updates about the agony that Bob was in and how his life was ebbing away. Young also poisoned at least 4 other co-workers, with his modus operandi being to slip poison into their tea or coffee. One of these people, Diana Smith, was poisoned when Young spiked her tea. Later, police found a diary entry where Young had written that Diana had, quote, irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days. Unfortunately, Young was able to avoid detection because, coincidentally, a stomach bug had been going around the local area, known as the, quote, Bovington bug, so it was assumed that the employees falling ill had succumbed to this virus. Before the truth could be revealed, 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadland Limited, Fred Biggs, was targeted by Young, who began by slipping small doses of antimony into his drinks. Then, on the 30th of October 1971, Young put a massive dose of thallium into Fred's tea, and within 24 hours, he developed chest pains and had difficulty breathing. Fred was soon transferred to the intensive care unit in Whittington Hospital in North London, and his last few weeks on Earth were like something out of a nightmare. His nervous system began to shut down, so he could not speak or breathe on his own. He was in perpetual excruciating pain, and eventually his skin began to peel off. Fred eventually died on the 17th of November 1971, and again poisoning was not suspected. Young was again revelling in his offending, calling the hospital and even Fred's wife to get updates on his condition. As with other psychopaths and narcissists, Graham Young couldn't help but find some way to brag about his behaviour, and his own arrogance was his undoing. Specifically, the day after Fred's death, the company doctor gathered all the staff and tried to reassure them due to the number of illnesses and deaths the company had had in such a short time. The doctor became concerned when Young began grilling him about thallium poisoning. Young's demeanour and his apparent expansive knowledge of poisons raised alarm bells, and the police were called. The police then looked into the situation and quickly found that the deaths and illnesses had started soon after Graham Young had started the company. They consulted with doctors who stated the symptoms of those who had died and become unwell was likely as a result of deliberate poisoning. They also saw Young's criminal record and could see the reasons why he had been sent to Broadmoor. Only then were the company informed of who Graham Young really was, but obviously by that point it was far too late. The police knew they had their man, and when they searched Graham Young's flat, they had all the evidence they needed. In particular, the most incriminating piece of evidence was a meticulous diary that Young had kept, in which he documented the progress of his, quote, patients, including dosages he had given them and resulting symptoms. He also wrote whether he was going to allow his victims to live or die. Also found in his property was enough poison to kill in excess of 300 people. In addition, it was found that Young had adorned his walls with pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as well as drawings of emaciated figures holding bottles labelled poison, clutching their throats. On November the 21st, 1971, Graham Young was finally arrested. Young gleefully confessed to poisoning and killing Bob Egle and Fred Biggs, as well as poisoning 2 other people. He bragged that he committed the, quote, perfect murder by killing his stepmother Molly Young in 1962. Young was eventually charged with multiple offences, including 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and he was held in prison awaiting his day in court. So, remember, we had a psychiatrist who stated that Graham Young was no longer a danger to society, so he should be released. And, in less than 10 months, he'd poisoned numerous people and murdered at least 2, and no one bothered to tell his employers that he was a poisoner whose modus operandi was to lace people's drinks. Absolutely mind-boggling. The evidence against Graham Young was overwhelming, not only due to his own confession, but the poisons found in his property and the fact that subsequently thallium had been found in the internal organs of Fred Biggs and in the cremated remains of Bob Egle. However, it was clear he was intent on enjoying the spotlight and so pleaded not guilty to all offences, resulting in him going to trial at St Albans Crown Court, which started on the 19th of June 1972. Young took the stand clearly as a way to demonstrate just how clever he was, and he assisted his defence in poking holes in the prosecution's case. It appears that Young potentially believed his own superiority and his lies, with him writing to a cousin stating, quote, I stand a good chance of acquittal, for the prosecution case has a number of inherent weaknesses. A strong point in my favour is that I am not guilty of the charges. To no one's surprise, Graham Young was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. I cannot find whether a minimum tariff was set, but I think it's likely that authorities wanted him to die behind bars, which, eventually, he did. So, by the age of 25, Graham Young was again behind bars, this time unlikely ever to be released. He was dubbed the Teacup Poisoner by the press, and it's clear that he revelled in his notoriety and demanded recognition in prison. In prison, Young continued to espouse his love of Hitler and would often grow a moustache in honour of his idol. He was hated by other prisoners, but one person he bonded with was Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, with the pair apparently bonding over their love of the Nazis. It's clear that evil attracts evil, and despite the remorselessness of Graham Young's offending, Ian Brady wrote that, quote, "It was difficult not to empathise with Graham Young." I cannot think of a worse pairing than Ian Brady and Graham Young, and the only positive of this story is that neither are amongst the living any longer. With Graham Young, on August the 1st, 1990, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. He was 42 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. However, Young had no history of heart disease, which led people to speculate that his death was suspicious and that he may have been killed by other inmates or staff. However, I think a more likely conclusion is that Young found a way to poison himself, ending his own life in order to escape justice, his last act of control. This is a fascinating case, as I don't think I've covered many people as cold and remorseless as Graham Young, and definitely not a case involving poison. Graham Young was, in my humble opinion, the epitome of a psychopath, a man who had no empathy or conscience for what he did. Young is, in many respects, an easier case to understand, as he made his motivation to the thinking quite obvious, with him stating, as already said, that he missed the power that the poisons gave him. And another insightful quote came from his final arrest where, when asked how he could justify killing human beings, he stated, quote, "I suppose I'd ceased to see them as people. At least, a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs." Taking these comments together, I believe that Graham Young saw himself as some sort of god, and mere mortals akin to rats running around a maze, with him in ultimate control of their fate and destiny. Young saw himself as superior to everyone, and those around him as annoyances to be experimented upon and disposed of when they became an inconvenience. I think that Young's early fascination with Hitler and Nazis was driven by the sense of power that one man can have, and how this can be bent to kill others on a mass scale, and he was trying to replicate the behaviour of his idol, including dressing like him and even growing a similar moustache. He also replicated the mass extermination technique used by this regime. In terms of poisoning, I think that Graham Young probably thought that he was born out of his time, and that he wished that he'd been born in a different time, in a different country, where he'd have willingly volunteered to be part of the final solution. However, as just one man, it's clear that Graham Young was intent on maiming and killing as many people as possible. Anyone was fair game, even his family members, and anyone who simply annoyed Young, even for the most trivial of reasons, including snoring, was deemed worthy of execution. It's clear that, whilst overestimating his intelligence, Graham Young had an astute intellect, and I think this is demonstrated by the nature of his offending, with him using poison, which needs skill to administer stealthily, and it's clear that he administers specific dosages depending on whether he wished to maim or kill. I imagine that Young felt ecstatic about how he was getting away with his crimes, how he was hiding in plain sight, and no one was any the wiser. I mentioned during the intro of this video that Young had killed at least 4 people, including his stepmother, a patient in Broadmoor, as well as the 2 workers at his last place of employment. However, how many people he actually killed is unclear, as it seems that the cause of death of all of the people he murdered were linked to natural causes until Young confessed. Clearly, as with the typical narcissist, Graham Young wanted praise and recognition for the work that he'd done, and I imagine he was holding back information to drip feed over the years whilst in prison. Maybe Graham Young wasn't getting the recognition he wanted and had become inconsequential, just another prisoner in the system, and that's why he took his own life. Or potentially he did indeed die of natural causes, but I find this unlikely. But, regardless of the nature of his passing, it's clear that Graham Young was an extremely dangerous and evil man, devoid of any humanity. So, what are your thoughts? Am I the only one who finds the decisions made in the case of Graham Young utterly baffling? I just wanted to say that you can now become a channel member. You get a cool little icon and early access to videos. But, more importantly, you can help support me work towards spending more time doing this, which I really enjoy. Also, if you like the video and my content, then please consider sending me a super thanks, which is in the list of options to the right of the share button. Honestly, no pressure, but any support would be greatly appreciated. Please also like, share and subscribe. Thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.